I have a question for you. How many of the 7 forms of wealth do you personally own? Yesterday in the video collection, we simplified sound economic theory and explored how to think about wealth and poverty and capital. I used some visual examples, a half-empty pizza box, to talk about zero-sum economic nonsense. And I showed just how much wheat and pig slop and how many tomato plants it would take to create 70,000 pizzas at the end of 2 growing seasons. And if you don't know the answer to this, check out the video called How Much Wealth Do You Have at This Moment of History? What we learned was that well-stewarded assets can grow into wealth, into real material capital. We create and hold wealth as different forms of capital, which can be studied in roughly 7 categories. So let me run through these as a general introduction. This is not the definitive list, but it is a useful breakdown. So let's start with category number 1. It's probably the most expensive form of wealth we will ever acquire. And we do require it too, but we need to acquire it. And it's personal character. It really costs us to acquire character. We have to sacrifice a whole lot of self-centeredness and what might gratify us in the present in order to contribute something to the future. Now, this is something that Western civilization has communicated to people. There's nothing wrong with being wealthy, especially in this particular category. It's to be pursued. And people who do pursue it and acquire this form of character acquire the other forms of wealth that we'll talk about. And wealthy people invest successfully in the future. We don't just consume and exploit the present and leave everything a desert for our children. That's how people lived before the traditions and the legacies and the inheritance of the Western civilization spread across, well, everywhere, starting in Western Europe, and that's really where it took root in the most fruitful way. People who are wealthy in personal character have, one of the main things they have as a virtue is humility, because somewhere along the way they sold off the liability of pride, and that's really what will slow us down and ruin us if that's how we are living and trying to live our lives day to day. And along the way, people who are wealthy in character also picked up faithfulness and honesty and consistency and discipline, and they developed their work ethic, and these are all things that are connected to personal character and many other virtues that we won't go into today, but you get the idea. You need virtue instead of vice, and you need it not just in a sort of an external way, so it's a veneer, so if you do business with somebody else, they sort of think you're a good guy. No, it's something so innate in you that people see it. And I heard one man say to another early on, who was beginning to marvel at this other man's personal character. He said, "I wish I could take what you have, put it in a bottle and sell it." Because he knew it was something that was extraordinarily valuable, but he couldn't wrap his hands around it. And of course he was thinking in terms of commercializing it somehow, sticking it in the bottle and selling it to people. But if people have it, they will see it. They will know you have it, and they will want it, and they will know that it's valuable, and they'll want to do business with you, either getting you on their team or teaming up with you within their team and doing things with you. And so people who are really rich in this strong moral character are both publicly and privately trustworthy because they've earned this trust through countless acts of being dependable and doing what is important and ethical at the same time. Doing what is important and ethical at the same time. That's what really marks them. They don't make pragmatic decisions just to get through the next day or the next business decision. They can just do this simultaneously, what's important and what's ethical at the same time. They can be trusted with small amounts of capital or responsibility and turn both into something larger. And they don't turn their noses up at something small. They are faithful with little and then prove themselves over time to be faithful with much. And they're just more and more financial wealth seems to go through their hands at that point. Once that they have this virtue of being faithful, they can take care of scarce resources without wasting or squandering or gambling them away. Personal character is the form of wealth without which others cannot be honestly sustained. You know, you can grab onto stuff and you can hire people to manage a lot of your assets, but to maintain everything honestly, you will need personal character. And it really helps. And even, men, I've seen men in my lifetime who've lost everything, and it's not a form of despair to them because they understand all these different forms of wealth we'll be talking about so well. They realize that, well, I've lost the things that people measure the most as wealth and capital. I've lost my money. I've lost my financial assets, but I haven't lost everything else. I haven't lost my personal character. I haven't lost these other things that we'll think about. And they realize that they're still extraordinarily wealthy, and that with these other forms of capital, they leverage those responsibly and honestly and get back up on their feet. There was one guy I knew who lost, I think it was, I forget the exact number, but he had to declare bankruptcy, not because he wanted to, but because his attorneys and everybody else said, look, you have to declare bankruptcy. And he said, but I don't want all these creditors to be stiffed. I want to pay them back. They said, well, you can pay them back. There's nothing stopping you from paying these people back. And so his creditors, who looked like they were not going to get a penny back when he declared bankruptcy, got everything back. I do remember that figure. It was $7 million. So this man who declared bankruptcy had nothing, but he started other businesses, got back on his feet, and the first thing he did was pay back everyone he owed money to, $7 million, and then continued to make more money, which was then his more personal fortune. But he wanted to, and he did, and he accomplished, and he succeeded in getting back on his feet. Okay, and so let's keep going. No matter how severe the crisis, proven strong character will sustain the one who possesses it with faith-informed optimism, not blind optimism, a clear-headed ability to think problems through so that he or she can see clearly where to invest and reinvest time and talent and other forms of wealth. It's people with strong character who are the most peaceful and content when hard situations hit, and they always hit, many times in a lifetime. Because these people, these wealthy people, are not easily discouraged or shaken by hard situations or crises, they just keep going. They don't need artificial things like money to make them happy. They derive happiness from life itself. Now, next, living capital is also called and can be called natural capital. It's found in the land and the oceans and can be called primary wealth, because we take that to start everything else with. Diverse and interlinked symbiotic systems of living organisms support the primary wealth upon which all populations have to depend and do depend. So when you think about the origins of the greatest civilization that we mentioned, Western civilization, remember its beginnings. Farming cultures replaced piratical raiding cultures like my ancestors. We were Viking. The only way we would get any kind of financial wealth or food, we would steal it from people. We would go raiding. And this all changed once we were introduced to Christianity. We changed the way that we thought of wealth and acquired wealth. We learned to work with the rich soils of Western Europe and Middle England and turn them into wealth to develop. And with that, really just working with dirt, we developed peaceful communities, a work ethic, free markets, then compounding wealth over interlocking generations. So there's massive wealth and a clean ecosystem. And if we don't have this because we've been so careless with the natural resources at our disposal, we can lose our capital base, which is the natural capital. This has happened when exploitive political systems strip the land bare to get short-term wealth for their own pleasure and leave nothing to the next generation. And here's a note about Midwest farmland. And I know quite a bit about the Midwest. What we're doing to the living capital in the richest farming acreage of the world is really bad. It's not good. We're destroying the wealth for the future generations. We've made ourselves vulnerable and poor because we've abused the topsoil and the water table, all in pursuit of an extra 3 to 5% yield per season. And the U.S. has pursued these destructive policies since the 1970s, at least, with agricultural subsidies for bulk chemicals and fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, and other toxins, which may have given us a few extra corn chips, but it's in the process really destroyed our farmland. Today the soil is really exhausted. The water table is poisoned by the runoff, and not just the upper aquifers, but several down below. It's a tragedy of our own making. Now, the third form of capital we call material capital, and that would be lumber and steel and produce and marketable food and commodities, all the stuff that we get from the primary capital, and we create from the primary sources of capital, which is, as we mentioned, the rich soil, the fishing grounds, the timber, the trees that grow up out of the ground, the ore, the land mass, the minerals, the forests, and other raw natural resources. What we make from that is material capital. Number 4, the fourth category, is the financial capital. And this is fungible money and currency used by humans today to exchange goods and services for secondary wealth, or to make claims on wealth, currency and stocks and bonds and contracts. And this is sometimes called tertiary wealth, which is built on the secondary and the primary capital of material capital. So all 7 forms of wealth, financial capital should never be thought to be the measure of success in life, but in materialistic American dream America, it has been held up as the goal, and that goal has ruined many lives. And this is not to say that financial capital is evil. No, that's not true. All of these forms of wealth are good, but if you sacrifice some of them just to get this one, financial capital, your life can be badly imbalanced and could be ruined. Number 5 is cultural capital, sometimes called social capital. And a person who's wealthy in social capital might be described as well-connected or influential. He's got a lot of contacts. He or she is in really good standing with people around them, largely because of the personal character they possess and how they apply that character with their friends and wise living. Family and friendships and interpersonal connections are the currency of this form of capital. A healthy contextual understanding of history and culture enlarges this social capital, and life won't be confusing, because what's happening now happened before, because you've got this context of history. You know what's going on. And you can move through life and move through history because you're maintaining all these close connections with people that are really, really strong. And it's intangible, really, what this is. Like traditions of family generations, several family generations, or the energy represented in family teamwork. But all this can often convert other forms of wealth into financial and material capital. And you've seen this happen in good, companies with a good, strong team that has a lot of this cultural capital and social capital intact, and families who preserve wealth for generation over generation. What do they have? Well, I studied the DuPont family at one point, and who came over after the French Revolution to get away from it and start new life in the United States of America, which was a very young country at the time, a brand new country. And they just simply used family traditions, and they had some very strong family traditions of unity and respect and deference to one another, respect for the elderly. They turned all of those traditions into an exploding business, and it was primarily gunpowder at the beginning, and they got rich. And that is the family in American history which has held on to family wealth longer and over many more generations than any other family. Number 5 is intellectual capital. This is acquired forms of knowledge and the tools of communication needed to trade in knowledge and with knowledge. You might get from a foreign country, one of the greatest educated men of his country, who comes to America. He can't even speak English, and so he really can't be said to have the intellectual capital that's valued in this country because he can't even communicate with anybody, though he may be the smartest guy in the whole country. So it's both. It's the acquired forms of knowledge and then the tools of communication. And that means even if you were raised here in the States and you're pretty smart and you know a lot of stuff about business and industry, if you can't communicate well to those around you or to your employees, you're going to have problems. When everything falls apart in your company, it's probably not the employee's fault. It's probably your failure to communicate. That's in my experience, every time there's been a minor disaster and things just really got chaotic, it was because I, as the leader, did not communicate clearly enough what my intentions were. The intent of the commander fell apart. Here's a story from Hungary. The first time I was in Budapest, I was really impressed with a number of bookstores. I was kind of shocked because there's so many. It seemed like there were more bookstores than any kind of shop. And many were containing shelf after shelf of 19th century books. So here's the history here. Throughout the 20th century, Hungary was completely impoverished and depleted of all material wealth and national economy. They just kept getting raided and destroyed by war. Budapest was occupied by the Nazis and then by the Soviets until 1989. These were both book-burning societies. But somehow, book owners protected their books. They were able to preserve little libraries, personal libraries, and all through this period of looting and book burning and the Soviet occupation, which really stripped everything out of their country and took it back. But apparently the Soviets just didn't take the books. And as soon as this occupation ended, the Soviet occupation ended in 1989, Hungarians immediately began applying centuries of intellectual capital to recreate their nation. And what they did was, they've created the fastest growing economy of Central Europe and actually of Western Europe. And I think up until COVID, and we just really don't know where anybody stands right now, they were the fastest growing economy, I think, of the entire world because of what they were doing. Intellectual capital is not necessarily, I got to make this point, it's not necessarily formal education. Don't get me wrong on this. This was once believed to be the road to financial success, and you had to do it. You had to go to college. You had to get your diploma in order to get a job that would give you security and then a pension, etc. No, that's a bad formula to think about. This intellectual capital was once believed that it could just be gained only in places called schools and then exchanged for financial capital later. No, wrong formula. That's absolutely the wrong formula. The days of academic credentialing now finally are being replaced by more honest measurements of intellectual capital. Now, number 6, going on quickly, experiential capital would include the knowledge gained by a steady history of work and study and wide exposure to literature and travel and success and failure and hardship and more success and more failure. You learn so much through failure. So don't be afraid of failure. And I would include to this broad human interaction. This gives you experiential capital. Are you rich with this? Or are you really poor in this? The quickest way, of course, to acquire this is to get a job to work alongside somebody much older and experienced. And your goal is to learn and absorb his experiential capital. And getting it firsthand is really valuable, but it is costly. You might invest quite a bit of time just being an apprentice to somebody like this. Now, you can also get it from reading, studying other people, doing your study. Well-read people have got this. They've got an awful lot of this kind of capital. You can also just talk to lots of other older people. Listen carefully, interview them carefully. And so here's a personal request I have here right now for older people who are listening to this. Do make an effort to enrich the young all you can by telling them about your experiential capital. Sometimes, so many millennials are so foolish, they don't even know what they don't know. And yes, this is a problem. This is a difficulty. And finally, the final category, number 7, is spiritual capital. This is the wisdom gained through a right personal relationship with the creator of the universe, who's a spiritual being. Yes, people can have a really wrong personal relationship with God, which is deceitful and fraudulent and insincere, running and hiding and being dishonest with themselves and God. And this is what life was like on my university. Everybody was saying you can't have any interest in this at all because there is no God. Period. That's dishonest. That's running and hiding. And this leads to total spiritual and superstitions. That just even holding that idea, that foolish idea that of course there is no God, no creator. What a foolish superstition that is. This leads to personal spiritual impoverishment. People were so completely and totally ignorant in this area back then in university. And again, it was just because it was politically incorrect to take any interest in spiritual things, and especially the correct spiritual things. Now, you could run around and say, hey, I think I'm going to run off and join a Buddhist monastery and pretend to be spiritual. But again, this is a wrong personal relationship with God, because what's his opinion on some of these other false religions? Well, they're false, and they'll lead you into impoverishment and lead you into blindness and spiritual blindness. So if we want to be rich in spiritual capital, we have to be honest. And what's really interesting right now, there is a growing trend in honesty in this one particular area. I've been very interested in the last few days, this new site that's being started by Jordan Peterson and some of his colleagues, ThinkSpot, is being populated by people who are just being very outspoken and honest about this. Who is God? How do we understand proper theology? How do we pursue God and seek after him and seek after what's true? How do we open the Bible and try to understand it? These things were forbidden, back in the days, like I said, when I was at university, particularly at my university. If you did this, you were immediately labeled as someone who was not very intellectually wise and didn't have much intellectual capital. But that's wrong. You need wealth in both. And faith is not blind faith, it's informed faith. And this is what you need to be pursuing honestly, and admit, that you're a creature and that you didn't make yourself, and that you need help in life. And if you want to have virtue, you need to look for a standard that's not your standard. And it's not the standard of some of these great business leaders like Carnegie. You've got to find what is God's standard for ethics in business, and for the virtues that you really want to have in your life, for personal character. So be honest about this and begin. I think places where you can look. I hope you will come frequently to this particular channel to find help in this particular area. I want you to be wealthy in spiritual capital in all of these particular categories. And I think during today's present crisis, the implosion of financial wealth will force a lot of people to begin valuing all these other forms of wealth in new ways, especially as they lose their financial capital. And each of these other forms of wealth are really available in quantity and quality. The personal character, the living capital of natural resources, which we can recover and we can improve on. We can clean up a little bit. The cultural capital, which many of us have missed just because we've had the nose to the grindstone for so long. Intellectual capital. Well, it's time to be studying and learning from the elderly, and learning from others. Experiential capital, and of course, spiritual capital. So please do dig into these. Dig into some more of the other videos on this channel. I want to connect with you. I want to hear from you. Send me questions at questions@jeffreybotkin.com. That's questions@jeffreybotkin.com. And I really do look forward to hearing from you, communicating with you, and engaging with you. Thanks.